The period from 800 BC to 200 BC is known as the Axial Age, a time when revolutionary thinking appeared simultaneously in various countries around the world. During this enlightened era, individuals such as Socrates, Confucius, and Lao Tzu made their appearance. It was during this time, around the middle of the 6th century BC, that Siddhartha Gautama, later known as the Buddha, or the Awakened One, was born in India. Theravada Buddhism, or the Way of the Elders, still flourishes in Southeast Asia, and its influence has spread throughout the world. Several factors distinguish this school of Buddhism. One factor is the importance it places on the enlightenment of the individual, with the ideal being the arahant, the person who has realized complete liberation from all forms of suffering. Another feature is its focus on the preservation of the original Dharma, or teachings of the Buddha. These teachings include a code of ethical conduct for monastics, a collection of discourses attributed to the Buddha and some of his closest disciples, and an organized collection of writings that can be applied to a systematic investigation into the nature of mind and matter. A third important factor is the emphasis Theravada Buddhism places on the monastic tradition. The monastic life is considered to be the most ideal for the pursuit of enlightenment, since monks are not distracted by worldly concerns or responsibilities. Over the past few decades, there have been meditation centers built specifically for lay people, where individuals can go for extended retreats and receive the type of support that had previously only been available for monastics. One such center, the Insight Meditation Society, was co-founded in 1975 by Joseph Goldstein, a prominent meditation teacher in the Theravada Buddhist tradition. In 2003, Joseph helped establish the Forest Refuge, a center designed to support longer, less structured personal retreats for more experienced meditators. Joseph has studied and practiced different forms of Buddhist meditation under eminent teachers from India, Burma, and Tibet. He's the author of A Heart Full of Peace, Insight Meditation, The Practice of Freedom, The Experience of Insight, and One Dharma, The Emerging Western Buddhism.
I was in the Peace Corps at the time. I was teaching English in Bangkok. And I had a friend, and we were both just beginning our exploration of Buddhism. And we were just sitting in his garden one afternoon, and he was reading from a Tibetan text. And it was an old translation of a text which has since been translated in a more accurate way. But this old translation at that time was called the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation. And he was just reading the text, and I was sitting there. My mind happened to be very still and very concentrated. I was just concentrating on the words as he was speaking. And the text is a direct pointing to the nature of the mind. Just so the word unborn was, and somehow just conditions came together, and just on hearing the word unborn, it's like something happened. It was like the unborn borned. It was just a split second, but it was like a kind of a lightning bolt, right? That just totally reorganize my understanding of things. We could call it a touching of the zero center, or an opening to the zero center, as opposed to the self center. And that was just a radical transformation of understanding. Of course, that was just the beginning. Then there's the work of really cultivating that understanding and integrating it, and working still with the many conditioned patterns and habits that remain in the mind. So I very much see that as a beginning rather than an endpoint. Dharma is a Sanskrit word and really has a wide range of meanings. It can mean the truth or the way. It can mean specifically the teachings of the Buddha. It's often used in that way as Buddha Dharma. It can mean particular elements of experience. Elements of mind and body are each called dharmas. So depending on the context, it will have a different meaning. It's generally used, and in the way I used it in my book, One Dharma, one truth. That there's one way of things, one nature of things. So I think that's the most general usage of that term. Selflessness is a core teaching, of the Buddhas. And it can be understood in a variety of ways, and it's not an easy concept for many people to get a handle on, because we're so conditioned in our lives to have a strong sense of self, and our whole lives revolve around a belief in I, a belief in me. So we can talk about it in different ways. In one way, it means that there is no one behind experience to whom the experience is happening. That what we call self is the flow of changing phenomena. And this includes mental, physical phenomena. So there's not a reference point of someone behind it to whom it's all referring. So that's one way of understanding it. Another way of understanding it is that the notion of self, or the notion of I, is a mental construct. One of the examples, in order to illustrate the conceptual nature of self, which I've used a lot over the years in teachings, and it's an example that people are very familiar with. When we go out at night and the sky is clear and we look up at the sky, and the stars, and we recognize the constellation, the Big Dipper. And that's a fairly easy constellation to pick out. So when we look up at the sky and see the Big Dipper, is there really a Big Dipper up in the sky? There's no Big Dipper. Big Dipper is a concept. We have created a construct which we're overlaying on a certain pattern of points of light. So then people think, well, I know that. It's clear that there's no Big Dipper in the sky. But then the challenge is to go outside at night, look up in the sky, and see if it's possible not to see the Big Dipper. It's very difficult, because we've been so conditioned to see in a certain way, to see through that conceptual framework. It's very difficult just to look up and not pick out those particular stars from all the others. So you can see if it's that difficult to not see the Big Dipper, it takes a bit of practice to experience this mind-body process without overlaying a concept of self onto it. But self, or Joseph, is in the same relationship to the mind-body process as Big Dipper is to stars in the sky. So Joseph is like Big Dipper. Self is like Big Dipper. But it's a concept, and it's a useful concept. So we're not saying that the idea of I or self is not operationally useful. This is how we engage in the world on this very relative plane, of one individual to another. It's just that we've lost sight of the deeper underlying reality of selflessness. Freedom really means, in one way of speaking of it, is freedom from attachment, freedom from clinging. One of the deepest conditioned attachments we have is attachment to the view of self. And this is very strong. It takes a lot of strong awareness and mindfulness and attention and wisdom to see through the conceptual nature of that construct, our attachment to this notion of self or this construct of self then leads to many other what in Buddhism are called defilements of mind or unwholesome tendencies. Because of this belief in self, we get easily caught up in desire, in greed, in fear, in anger, in fear of death. Right? If we were not attached to a sense of self, birth and death would be seen in a very different way. So it's the basis, and you could say in some way it's the root of much of the attachment in our lives. Emptiness in the Buddhist way of understanding things can refer to different things. And in a way it's a slightly unfortunate word in English because people have associations with emptiness that are not all that appealing. You know, say everything's empty and people feel, maybe gray or vacuity, or it's not a particularly attractive notion in terms of describing our lives and who we are and the nature of freedom. So it takes the effort to investigate what's actually meant by the term. One meaning of the term emptiness is emptiness of self. And so it refers specifically to that aspect, that there's no one permanent, unchanging being or core behind experience. So that's one meaning. Another meaning of emptiness is that all phenomena is conditioned by causes, and so nothing has an intrinsic self-existence independent of the causes and conditions which bring it about. And so this is a very profound aspect of the teachings and about meditative insights, to begin to see this empty nature of phenomena, empty in the sense of insubstantial. Just another example which might illustrate this, and it ties into selflessness as well. If you go outside in the summer and maybe there was a recent rain and there's a rainbow in the sky, we look up at the rainbow and most of us feel kind of a delight in seeing it because it's a beautiful phenomenon. But then we look or investigate a little more closely. Is there actually anything in itself which is the rainbow? What is a rainbow? A rainbow is an appearance arising out of certain conditions coming together of light, of moisture, of air. Conditions come together in a certain way, and a rainbow appears. Conditions change, the rainbow disappears. So there's nothing substantially existent, that thing that is the rainbow. Right? So it's insubstantial in that way. This doesn't imply that there's no appearance, because there is. We see the rainbow in the sky and we're delighted by it. So it's this understanding of appearance and insubstantiality, right, which again is what emptiness really is about. Different Buddhist traditions have different views on the nature or the meaning of the term nirvana, which in most of the Buddhist traditions refers to the highest peace or the highest realization. In the most pragmatic description of it, nirvana has been described as the purification, the mind that's purified of greed and hatred and delusion. So that's the easiest one for us to grasp. It's not kind of esoteric metaphysics. It's, okay, we look at our minds and are there still the forces of greed and hatred and delusion at work or not? We can get what might be called a glimpse of nirvana or momentary nirvana in those moments when the mind is free of those forces. So we can get a taste of the coolness. But the term really applies or signifies the mind which has been totally purified of them. One of the Buddha's teachings is about how the mind is inherently pure, but it's conditioned or colored by visiting defilements. Right? And so the defilements come, they're conditioned, but they are not intrinsic to the mind. So from the perspective of the mind being inherently pure, we could say, yes, it's inherently free, and somehow we have to come back to that. From the other side, and another aspect of the Buddha's teachings, is that the arising of these visiting defilements in the mind, right, what basically could be termed samsara, just the world of conditioned existence, the Buddha described that as being beginningless. So the presence of these defiling factors have always been with us, and yet they are not intrinsic to the mind. So if you focus on the beginningless aspect of the defilements, you might say, no, it's not inherently free, and we have to do the work to purify the mind of the defilements. If you emphasize the side of the mind is inherently pure, and the defilements are only visiting, if you're emphasizing that side, so then the methodology might be to recognize that quality of inherent purity, right? And to see the empty nature of the defilements themselves. For my own practice, I found it very helpful not to create a polarity between these two perspectives. We could say negative conditioning forces. So I think that is definitely part of the teachings. That's a very high bar. That's a very high realization. There are people, and I've met some of them, who are reputed to be fully enlightened, fully accomplished. Of course, there's no way to really assess. They're rare, and I've met many more people, both in Asia and in this country, people walking on the path who have had significant transforming experiences, that are on the way to that, where there might be like a real touching of ultimate truth, but still with much more work to be done. So I think that it's both. Certainly within Buddhism, the goal of full awakening is definitely there. For me, there's rather than try to find an equation on the level of metaphysics, I think it's much more helpful and much more accessible and pragmatic to really look at the qualities in the mind that have been realized or cultivated. For example, Is there greater love? Is there greater wisdom? Is there greater compassion? Is there greater kindness? Is there more fear? Is there more self-centeredness? I think when we look at the actual qualities that are there, then we can see, then we can begin to compare, oh yeah, these traditions seem to be developing the same qualities. Right? Whether the ultimate metaphysical absolute is the same or not, I'd be very skeptical of somebody claiming to know. Because I would just ask, how does one know? If we define the experience of ultimate truth as the mind being free of greed, hatred, delusion, and there are some subtleties right of a commonality of understanding, a commonality of respect for different spiritual paths. Because anger works the same way in the mind, whether one is American or Tibetan or Indian or Chinese. There's no Chinese anger, and there's no American greed, and there's no Indian love. Right? These are universal qualities of mind, and they work in the same way in all people. And so freeing, and the nature of awareness, the nature of consciousness, that which knows different experience, is the same in all people. The particular patterns of conditioning are very different, because there have been different conditioning forces in our lives. But once we understand the nature of these elements of the mind, and the nature of the mind itself, that gives a confidence, in understanding, yes, if one has freed the mind from these defilements, in whatever tradition, that then the work has been accomplished. Because there's a little teaching by the writer Wei Wu Wei, who wrote some wonderful books. And he has these little aphorisms. And he said, what are most people doing? Worshipping the teapot instead of drinking the tea. So we can get so caught up in attachment to the teapot and in worshipping the teapot, the methodology, the form, and really miss the fact that it's the drinking of the tea that's important. What is it that all these methodologies or forms are accomplishing or not? And so we have to really see. And that's where it takes a lot of honesty, it takes a lot of courage, to be willing to look into one's own mind, to one's own heart, and take a very honest look at what is actually there. There's a common Western notion, and I think a highly valued notion of follow your heart. We should follow our heart. Well, one Buddhist teacher, Ajahn Sumedho, he turned that around a little bit, and he said, it's not a question of following your heart, it's a question of training your heart. And I think that's a very important difference, because there's a lot that's going on in our hearts. There's a lot that's wonderful and noble and pure and all the great things, but there's a lot that's not. There's a lot that's driven by greed or desire or fear. So it's not just a question of following our hearts, it's a question of really seeing what's there and training our hearts, in what is good, in what is wholesome. For me, it's important to understand in a very fundamental way the Buddha did not teach Buddhism. The whole notion of Buddhism came much later. It was actually a European concept put on the traditions of people practicing the Buddha's teachings. So what the Buddha taught was not Buddhism. What the Buddha taught was a way of seeing things very directly in our own experience, and seeing the truth of them, seeing the impermanence of phenomena, seeing what forces in the mind make one happier, what forces in the mind make one more peaceful. So this practice or this understanding does not depend on becoming anything. It doesn't depend on joining any religion or signing up for anything. It all has to do with whether we have an interest in understanding ourselves. If that interest is there, then there are many methodologies which can help. It can show us a way for that exploration. So I'll just give you one example. It's a little story. When I was in the Peace Corps in Thailand, that was where I had my first introduction to the Buddhist teachings. And I had studied philosophy in college. And so I went to the Peace Corps, and I was teaching in Bangkok, and I started going to these discussion groups at the Marble Temple, which is one of the famous temples there. And there were two monks, Western monks, who were leading the discussion group for Westerners. So I went, and I was just full of all my philosophical background, and I was asking a million questions. It was so bad that people actually stopped coming to the group because I was going. Because there's always one person in a group like that. Anyway, finally, out of some, I think, perhaps desperation, one of the monks said, "Joseph, why don't you try meditating?" And I think it was just a way of quiet me down a little bit. So I was like 20 years old, 21 years old, in the Far East. It was all new, exotic, surrounded by all these Buddha images. So I thought, oh great, this will be a really fantastic thing to do. So I get all my paraphernalia together. I get my cushions and this and that. And he gave me the basic instruction of just watching the breath. And I sat down. I set my alarm clock for 5 minutes because I didn't want to sit too much. So I sit down, close my eyes, set my alarm clock, 5 minutes, just watching the breath go in and out. It was amazing. Something very extraordinary happened in those 5 minutes. And it wasn't that I had some great enlightening experience. But what I saw was, and I saw very clearly and directly, that there was a way to look into my mind as well as looking out through it. And just that. It was like turning in place, and just to see there is a way for me to explore my own mind. It was so exciting to me, because nobody, even though it's as obvious as can be, nobody had ever pointed that out. So this didn't have anything to do with becoming a Buddhist or joining anything. It just had to do with turning my attention inward and finding a way to do it. I got so excited by this. I was really so enthusiastic. I used to invite my friends over to watch me meditate, but they didn't come back too often. So that's what's possible, and that's possible for anybody. Sometimes people question, what's the relationship between psychotherapy and meditation? It seems like there's a big overlapping. There are some areas of overlap, but there are also some significant areas that don't overlap. For the most part, psychotherapy is interested in exploring the content of one's mind, the content of our thoughts and emotions, and how they were conditioned, and maybe forces in our childhood that led to certain patterns now. So the content of what's arising is very important. In meditation, the content is really just the jumping off point. We do want to recognize, what kinds of thoughts, what kind of feeling, what kind of emotions. But I think meditation and the teachings in general then go much deeper than that. And they go deeper in a couple of ways. One is there's an ethical framework to the teachings where there's a real recognition some mind states are unwholesome, and that is they lead to suffering for oneself and others. Others are wholesome, they lead to happiness, and there's an ethical imperative that follows from that if we really care about happiness and peace in the world. So that ethical framework, I think, is quite important. But even deeper than that is when we go from an interest in the content of what's arising to the nature of the process itself. And we're giving more emphasis to seeing just how everything in the mind and body is simply arising and is there for a short while and passes away. And so we go from the level of content to the level of process. And that's where our insight into the truth of change, of impermanence, becomes strongly integrated in our lives. The more we see the changing nature of things, the less we're attached. The less we're attached, the less we suffer. And so that's why it's a path to freedom. I think one of the reasons there are so many different religions in the world, I think the reason was expressed by the Buddha when he said that he sees nothing more varied than the quality of people's minds. Our minds are conditioned in so many different ways, from so many different forces, from genetics to our education and our parents and our culture and perhaps past lives, and there's so many conditioning forces at work. And in that sense, our conditioning is all quite unique. And so people will be drawn either temperamentally or karmically or just the circumstances of their lives, where they happen to be born, will be led to one set of beliefs or religion or another. So I think it just reflects the tremendous variety that's in our minds. One of the great attachments that the Buddha spoke of, and we see played out in so many levels, both in spiritual traditions and also in worldly endeavors, one of the great attachments the Buddha spoke of is attachment to view. And whether it's religious views or political views or economic views, there's this very strong tendency in the mind. It's a very deeply conditioned habit of mind to become attached to our particular viewpoint on things. And the stronger the attachment, of course, the more conflict we are in with people who hold opposing views. And so this is the cause of so much conflict in the world, and as we know, and we've all seen, people fighting over a different name of God. When you look at it from outside the conflict, it seems absurd. And yet, from within the conflict, it often feels to be a matter of life and death. So we can see how strong that attachment is. One of the things that was very helpful for me as I was writing One Dharma, and the motivation for writing it was having studied different traditions within Buddhism who were saying different things about the nature of ultimate truth. And they were saying opposing things about the nature of ultimate truth. And I had teachers who I respected equally representing these views, and these teachers, at least from my perspective, had realized their teachings. Right? So it wasn't just a philosophic dissertation. These were people who had practiced and realized according to a certain tradition and was describing things in a certain way. So I was faced with this huge conflict, and it was really like a spiritual crisis for me, because teachers that I respected tremendously saying different things about what I felt was most important. So I struggled with this. I was on one retreat where this was my koan. I was really struggling with this for a couple of months. And it finally resolved in an understanding which was so freeing for me. And I phrased it in the way of metaphysics as skillful means, rather than as being statements of ultimate truth. Because when you have a metaphysical position, ultimate truth is like this, or ultimate truth is like this. If you hold that metaphysical statement to be the truth, then any opposing statement obviously is going to be in conflict. If you hold those statements of ultimate truth to be skillful means for freeing the mind from grasping, for freeing the mind from clinging, belief is more on the level of an opinion about something, and not necessarily based on an experienced reality. Whereas when I use the word faith, for myself, I would define that as a quality of confidence based on one's own experience. And so that seems to me a big difference in terms of the terms. It was very interesting. I've been a participant in several Buddhist-Christian dialogues. There was most disagreement on the level of theology. There was almost complete agreement on the level of values. And that was so interesting to me. You can have all kinds of theological debates, but in terms of people valuing love and valuing compassion and valuing generosity and valuing kindness, there was no disagreement at all. So then we just look at the different teachings, and we really need to be honest with ourselves, because it's very easy to fall into self-delusion. So we need a strong degree of honesty to see, okay, as I'm practicing this, what is the effect? Where is it leading? In terms of how we are with other traditions, I'll just share with you one story that was so beautiful to me and so meaningful. At one of these conferences, it was held at Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky, which is where Thomas Merton, had lived and been a hermit and wrote. So at this conference, there were 25 Buddhists and 25 Christians, and then many people observing. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama was one of the participants. And the abbot of the monastery Gethsemane, in his concluding remarks, highlighted one incident that for him represented more of what inter-religious dialogue is about than any of the words that were spoken. And he said, one day we had come out of, I guess it was called the chapter house, where we were meeting. And there was this big, wide hallway, in the monastery. And the Dalai Lama was walking down the hall, and he came to a statue of the Virgin Mary. And he just stopped for a moment and bowed, paid respects, and then walked on. And he didn't know, His Holiness didn't know anybody was watching. It was just a completely spontaneous, heartfelt gesture of respect, for what the Virgin Mary symbolizes. And when the abbot of the monastery was telling this story, he said, just seeing His Holiness do that, pay respects, to an image from another tradition, that was more meaningful to him than all the words of the conference. And I felt it's a beautiful moment, when we can have respect, even if we have different viewpoints or views. So I think that's how it can happen. I'll just, from another side, one of the other interesting things that happened in that conference was also one of the Buddhist participants, who was a Zen teacher, a wonderful poet and wonderful guy, quite accomplished. He got up, and he had written a book on the Psalms. And he got up and he challenged the group in terms of some of the language in the Psalms, which is quite violent. There's a lot of strong, even violent terminology that's used. And so he was really, in a very respectful way, he was, well, what's this about? And how is this understood? And that provoked one of the most interesting discussions of the conference. So I think it doesn't always mean just covering over differences. It's really inquiring. Okay, when we do have questions, or there are things that seem, what does this actually mean? Then part of the dialogue needs to be that kind of forthrightness and honesty. But again, it came completely from a place of respect. And that's what made the dialogue possible and so beautiful. A lot of people are confronting the absence of world peace and really trying to investigate what can we do. But there are two aspects which I'll just highlight, but these are just two of many. One is, and I think this would be a common spiritual understanding, that we need to start with ourselves. If our minds are filled with anger, and filled with hatred, and filled with jealousy, and filled with envy, and filled with fear, then that's what we're contributing to the world. And so our primary responsibility is to, through some method or other, through some tradition or other, through some means, to purify our own minds and hearts. And the more people that do that, the less anger, the less fear, the less hatred, the less envy there will be in the world. And so it is encouraging to see, both in this country and in many places around the world, kind of a renewed interest in meditative techniques of one kind or another that really aim to transform our own understanding. And that just seems essential. So that's what we can do on a very personal, individual level. And we can see the effect immediately on the people around us. So that, I have hopes that that can spread as more people practice in that way and become more aware. The potential for, a tremendous rippling out. The other piece that seems very important to me, and I've seen it on many levels of social organization, whether it's a particular organization that one's involved in, or local culture and politics, or national politics, or international, at whatever level we look at. I think that we need to acknowledge the tremendous impact of people in the leadership roles and choose people for leadership roles who have the capacity and the understanding and the wisdom and the compassion to lead in a way that will bring about more peace in the world. I just see leadership as being a tremendously important thing. And I know for myself it's been a learning process to realize how important it is. Because so often, again, both on a very local individual level, but also on the national level, I've heard in the past in my own mind, and have heard it voiced very often, oh, it doesn't matter it's all the same. Right? It doesn't matter who's leading the organization, who's leading the country, but I think it does matter. And I think it has a huge impact. And so, just as individuals, it's important to take responsibility for that, in how we choose people and who we choose. Because I think that is really the key. The question of how to maintain one's spiritual perspective in engagement in the world, when we are involved and busy, I think there are two aspects. I think one aspect is having a regular daily practice, whatever particular spiritual form one is engaged in, but in a formal way, whether it's sitting meditation or prayer or whatever it might be, but that it's actually done regularly, because that's a daily renewal then of the connection to our highest values. And without that, it's very easy to be caught up in the conditioning of the world. So I think the discipline of that kind of daily practice and commitment is extremely helpful. The other aspect, in some ways more general, but even more important, and that is the way, and one of our teachers expressed this, just in a very incisive way. We said the way to bring the practice into the world, is to really want to. And so we really have to look at our motivation. We have to see, is this something I really want to do, or am I thinking, oh yes, it would be good if I could do it, but it's too difficult and there are too many other forces. We kind of make excuses or rationalizations for not doing it. But if that fire is there, if we really feel, yes, this is the most important thing I can do, is to pay attention, to stay aware. It's that fire, it's that intensity of interest, which then makes it happen. So I think those are the two components. The more love, the better. But when we look carefully at what it is that we're calling love, when we look carefully at our experience, very often it's mixed in with other things. It can very easily be mixed in with attachment. It can be mixed in with desire. And so just think, if we think of the people we most love, and we ask, well, is there attachment to this person? I think for most people there would be, and it's even hard to imagine love without attachment. How could I love this person and not be attached? So it gets interesting to take it a step further and to really look and see, okay, what is the experience when I'm most loving? What is that like? And my experience has been, when I'm most loving, the energy is just flowing out towards the other person. It's like a generosity of the heart. And then when I look at when I'm most attached to the other person, the energy is one of holding, of grasping, of not letting go. Well, when we can see this clearly, we see these are two completely different things. They're not only are they not inherently connected, they actually oppose each other. Attachment does not enhance love. Right? It only detracts from it. But unless we untangle it in our own understanding and really see the difference, then for most of us we just go on through our lives with those two strands intertwined. So that's an example, where we can agree that love is an important value, but it's not enough to just stay there. We really need to probe further. Okay, what is it that I'm calling love? And are other things mixed in? And the same with compassion, or the same with joy, or the same with equanimity. And so that's the challenge, and in some way the excitement or the interest of a spiritual journey. I think the question of meaning of life and finding meaning of life has to do with understanding oneself, and really understanding the nature of our minds and the nature of our hearts. And the only way to do that is through some means or another to take a look. When I first went to India, I was looking for a teacher, and I was just traveling around meeting different teachers. I ended up in Bodh Gaya, in the place the Buddha was enlightened. And at that time it was just a small village and very, very few Westerners, very uncrowded. And I met my first teacher there. His name was Anagarika Munindra. And he said something just in the very first meeting which totally captured my sense of what was possible and why. He said, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. That was all. There was no belief system, there was nothing to join, there was nothing. It was just as simple and as common sense as that. If we want to understand ourselves, we have to sit down or stand up or be in some posture and observe. What is our mind doing? What are the qualities in our heart? And it's only out of that understanding that a sense of meaning begins to emerge, and we actually are fulfilled. flows into the other. So in one way, it's very simple, but I think for me, it has profound implications.
Another teacher that represents the rich legacy of the Theravada Buddhist tradition is Ajahn Amaro. He is the co-abbot of Abhagiri Monastery in California. His practice and teachings are in the style of his teacher, the late Ajahn Chah, one of the most respected meditation masters in the Thai forest tradition. This tradition emphasizes the use of remote wilderness areas and forest dwellings as the training grounds for spiritual practice and realization. Ajahn Amaro is the author of Silent Rain and Small Boat Great Mountain, and most recently co-authored an anthology of the Buddhist teachings on Nibbana.